Some people talk to themselves constantly, out loud, every single day. Other people have never once heard an inner voice in their entire lives, not even reading these words right now. Both groups think the other one is the strange one. Only one theory can actually explain why they're both wrong. Let's start with the version almost everyone on Earth experiences, whether they say it out loud or not. Inner speech, the running commentary in your head narrating your day, rehearsing conversations, arguing with yourself about what to eat, isn't a quirky side effect of having a brain. Researchers who study this consider it a core cognitive tool, when your brain uses constantly to plan, regulate emotion, and hold information in working memory long enough to use it. The theory explaining where this voice actually comes from is almost a century old. In the 1930s, Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky spent years observing children at play, and he noticed something adults had mostly dismissed as meaningless noise. Young children constantly narrate their own actions out loud while playing, with nobody listening and no apparent purpose. The block goes here, now the red one. Vygotsky called this private speech, and his theory was that it isn't meaningless at all. He argued that children are literally thinking out loud because the ability to think silently hasn't finished developing yet. Speech starts as a social tool, used to communicate with others. Then gradually, children start using that same tool on themselves, out loud, to guide their own behavior. Over years, that out loud narration doesn't disappear. It goes underground, compressing into the silent, internal voice most adults use instead. Under this theory, your inner voice isn't a separate thing from talking. It's talking, just quieter, having moved indoors. Brain imaging backs this up more directly than Vygotsky could have proven in his own lifetime. Studies using fMRI have found that when people engage in silent inner speech, the exact same speech production regions of the brain activate that light up when they talk out loud, Broca's area among them, just with the actual muscle movement suppressed before it reaches your mouth. Your inner voice isn't a metaphorical voice. It's a real speech signal, generated by real speech machinery, that simply gets stopped one step before sound, which raises an obvious question. If silent inner speech is supposedly the more developed, more efficient version, why do so many adults still talk to themselves out loud, especially under pressure? Because the research says out loud might genuinely work better. In 2011, cognitive scientists Gary Lupien and Daniel Swigley ran a study specifically testing this. They had participants search for objects, sometimes silently, sometimes while repeating the object's name out loud. The results were consistent. People who said the object's name out loud found it significantly faster than people searching in silence. Saying it out loud wasn't a symptom of struggling. It was a tool that measurably worked. The theory is that speaking a word out loud reactivates the specific visual features tied to that word more strongly than simply thinking it does. Saying keys doesn't just remind you what you're looking for. It appears to sharpen your visual search for the exact shape and color of keys, in a way silent thought doesn't do quite as effectively. But how you talk to yourself seems to matter just as much as whether you do it at all. Psychologist Kross has spent years studying something called distanced self-talk. His research found that people who address themselves using their own name, or the word you, instead of I, during stressful situations, perform measurably better under pressure. Not "I can handle this." Something closer to using your own name, the way a coach would. In one of Kross's studies, people preparing for a stressful public speaking task who used this distanced framing showed lower physiological stress responses and were rated as more confident and effective speakers by outside observers, compared to people who coach themselves using I. The theory is that using your own name creates just enough psychological distance to think about yourself the way you'd think about advising a friend, rather than being fully inside the panic yourself. The exact words you use on yourself apparently change the outcome. But self-talk isn't automatically a tool that helps. Kross's broader research on inner speech has also documented its darker version, chatter, the kind of repetitive, looping negative self-talk that doesn't solve anything and mostly just replays a problem on an endless loop. His work suggests the difference between helpful self-talk and harmful rumination often comes down to that same small shift in framing. Zooming out and addressing yourself like an outside observer tends to produce useful, action-oriented thoughts. Staying locked in first person I tends to spiral instead. same mental tool. Wildly different results, depending entirely on how it's aimed. Here's where it gets stranger, though, because none of this explains the people who don't have an inner voice at all. For decades, psychologist Russell Hurlburt at the University of Nevada has run a method called descriptive experience sampling, interrupting people at random moments throughout their day and asking them to describe, in detail, exactly what was happening in their mind the instant before the interruption. His research turned up something unexpected. A meaningful percentage of people reported no inner verbal narration during those sampled moments at all, not occasionally quiet, never present. This condition has more recently picked up an informal name, anendophasia, and anecdotal reports about it went viral once people realized how differently other minds could apparently be wired. The realization tends to happen the same way almost every time. Someone casually says, "When I think, I hear myself talking," and someone else in the conversation says, confused, "Wait, you actually hear words. I don't have that at all." Both people had spent their entire lives assuming everyone's mind worked exactly like their own, because there was never an obvious reason to check. Researchers have noted this often travels alongside a related but separate phenomenon, aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily picture images in the mind's eye. Someone can have one without the other, or both, or neither, suggesting the brain has several independent internal channels, verbal, visual, spatial, that can each be strong, weak, or nearly silent, largely independent of general intelligence or reasoning ability. People without an inner monologue aren't missing thought. They're simply not running it through words. Many report thinking in images, spatial relationships, or a kind of wordless, just knowing instead, arriving at the same conclusions and decisions as everyone else, just without narrating the process to themselves in language along the way. On memory and reasoning tests, people without an inner voice generally perform within a completely normal range. Whatever their brain is doing instead, it isn't obviously worse. It's just differently built. Which means talking to yourself and never talking to yourself aren't opposite ends of a spectrum from healthy to broken. They're two different configurations doing roughly the same underlying job, using completely different tools to do it. You can actually see both strategies competing for the exact same task in elite performance settings today. Athletes preparing for a critical moment, a free throw, a serve, a penalty kick, are frequently coached to use short, specific verbal self-cues out loud or under their breath, closely mirroring the Luppian and Swiggly result. Elbow up, follow through, not a pep talk. A verbal search cue, aimed at a body part instead of a set of keys. Meanwhile, some elite performers report almost no verbal narration at all in their moment of peak focus, describing it instead as pure feel, pure image, no words required, sometimes calling it simply letting the body take over once the conscious verbal layer goes quiet. Both groups are elite. Both strategies work. Neither one is the real way a high-performing brain is supposed to operate. So the next time you catch yourself muttering out loud while looking for your keys, or arguing with yourself using your own name before a hard conversation, understand what's actually happening. You're not slipping. You're running a genuinely effective cognitive tool, one with real, measurable research behind it, dating back to a Russian psychologist watching children play nearly a century ago. And if you've never once heard a voice in your own head at all, you're not missing anything either. You were simply never assigned words for the job. Your mind found a different, equally valid way to think without them. There was never only one correct way to run a mind. There were always several, quietly running side by side in different people, and every single one of them, somehow, still arrives at the exact same place.